Eli Tran hadn't set foot in an economy cabin in over 7 years. Not since Horizon Skies had grown from a scrappy startup with 3 leased planes into a publicly traded airline, flying to 32 cities across North America. Back then, he'd known every pilot by name, every flight attendant by their favorite coffee order, and every mechanic by the way they'd whistle while tightening bolts. He'd walk the tarmac in worn-out boots, clipboard in hand, listening, really listening, to anyone who had something to say about how to make flying just a little less stressful, a little more human. But somewhere along the way, between investor calls and quarterly reports, the voices had gotten quieter, or maybe he'd just stopped hearing them. Lately, though, something felt off. Customer satisfaction scores were slipping. Social media buzz had shifted from Horizon Skies gets it right to another delayed flight, another broken promise. Internal surveys showed crew morale at an all-time low. The executive team kept saying it was industry-wide pressure or post-pandemic fatigue, but Eli wasn't buying it. Numbers on a screen didn't tell the whole story. He needed to be there, in the middle of it, anonymous, invisible, just another passenger with a carry-on and a window seat. So he booked a ticket. Not in first class, not with a priority boarding pass, but in the very back row of coach on Flight 422 from Denver to Seattle. He used a fake name, Ben Carter, and paid full price with a burner credit card. He wore old jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No watch, no phone case with a logo, no telltale signs of wealth or position. Just a man who looked like he'd spent the morning fixing a leaky faucet and was now heading home to see his dog. The morning of the flight, he arrived at the airport 2 hours early, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to experience the whole journey. He stood in the security line behind a family juggling strollers and snacks, watched a college student panic when her laptop wouldn't come out of her backpack fast enough, and saw an elderly man fumble with his boarding pass until a TSA agent gently stepped in to help. None of it was dramatic, but it was real, and that's what he was after. At the gate, things felt colder. The Horizon Skies staff behind the counter moved like robots, efficient but distant. No smiles, no eye contact. When a passenger asked if there'd be room for his guitar in the overhead bin, the agent barely looked up. If it fits, it flies. If not, it doesn't. That used to be a playful slogan Eli had coined during the company's first year. Now it sounded like a threat. Eli's stomach tightened. He remembered the day he'd written that phrase on a whiteboard during a team huddle. It was meant to be lighthearted, a reminder that they were flexible, that they'd find a way to make things work for people. Now it felt like a wall. Boarding began, and he waited until the very end, letting families and elderly passengers go first. As he walked down the jet bridge, he ran his hand along the wall, feeling the hum of the aircraft's systems beneath his palm. This plane, a Boeing 737-800, was one of the first Horizon Skies had ever owned. He'd named it the Pathfinder. Now it just had a tail number, N738HS. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Overhead bins were already crammed. A flight attendant stood near the galley, arms crossed, watching passengers like she was counting down the minutes until she could leave. Eli found his seat, 32F window last row, and slid in, stowing his small backpack under the seat in front. The cushion was thin, the armrest sticky in one spot. He didn't mind. This was exactly what he needed to see. He kept his head down, pretending to scroll through his phone, but his ears were wide open. Conversations floated around him, a couple arguing about missed connections, a teenager complaining about Wi-Fi, a woman reassuring her nervous child. Then, just as the cabin doors closed and the engines began their low rumble, 2 people settled into the seats directly behind him. He didn't turn, didn't even shift, but he listened. The first voice was tired, deep, steady, the kind that's used to giving comfort but rarely receives it. I swear if they lose my bag again, I'm switching airlines for good. The second voice was lighter, sharper, laced with frustration. You still fly Horizon Skies? After everything? A pause, then a sigh. I used to love them. Back when they actually felt like they cared. Eli froze. It wasn't the criticism that hit him. It was the disappointment. The quiet, aching kind that comes when something you believed in lets you down not with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny paper cuts. He knew that tone. He'd heard it before in his own voice years ago, when he'd worked for a big legacy carrier and watched them treat passengers like cargo. Now somehow, his own company had become the thing he'd once sworn to fix. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway. Outside, Denver's morning sun glinted off the wings. Inside, the flight attendants ran through the safety demonstration with practiced monotony. No warmth, no spark, just words recited by rote. Eli closed his eyes and leaned his head against the window. He thought about the early days, how he'd slept on airport benches to test overnight layovers, how he'd personally called every customer who filed a complaint, how he'd once rerouted an entire flight to help a passenger reach a dying relative. Back then, Horizon Skies wasn't just an airline. It was a promise, but promises are easy to make, harder to keep when you're chasing growth, pleasing shareholders, cutting costs. As the plane lifted off the ground, pressing him gently into his seat, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't leave this flight the same man who boarded it. Something had to change. Not next quarter. Not after the next board meeting. Now. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he had to listen, really listen to the people behind him, and to everyone else on this plane who'd once trusted his airline with their time, their money, their lives. The nurse behind him shifted in her seat, pulling a small cooler onto her lap. "I just hope they don't mess with my meds," she murmured. Her friend whispered back, "They used to be better than this." Eli didn't turn around, but in that moment, he felt the weight of every decision he'd deferred, every corner he'd cut, every human moment he'd allowed to be replaced by policy. The sky outside was clear, endless, full of possibility, but inside the air felt heavy with regret. And for the first time in years, Eli Tran didn't feel like a CEO. He just felt like a man who'd lost his way and was finally ready to find it again. The plane leveled off somewhere over Wyoming, and the seatbelt sign clicked off with a soft chime. Most passengers exhaled like they'd been holding their breath. A few stood to stretch. Others reached for snacks or earbuds. But Eli stayed still, eyes on the clouds outside, ears tuned to the conversation behind him. At first it was quiet, just the hum of the engines and the rustle of a magazine being flipped. Then softly the nurse spoke again. "I missed her recital," she said, voice barely above a whisper, like she was afraid the plane itself might judge her. "My daughter's been practicing that piano piece for months. She even made me a little program with my name on it, for Mom, who works too hard." She let out a shaky laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. "And I wasn't there, because my bag never made it off the carousel in Chicago." Again, her friend didn't say anything for a moment, just reached over and squeezed her hand. Eli could hear the quiet click of a water bottle being unscrewed. "They told me it'd be on the next flight," the nurse went on. "But next flight turned into tomorrow, and tomorrow turned into we can't locate it. I had my dress in there, my good shoes. Even the little flower pin my mom gave me before she passed, gone, just gone." Eli's throat tightened. He remembered the flower pin detail because it was the kind of thing Horizon Skies used to track with care. In the early days, lost items weren't just logged. They were treated like personal treasures. He'd once spent an entire afternoon helping a passenger track down a child-stuffed rabbit that had been left in a seat-back pocket. They'd found it, washed it, and hand-delivered it to the family's hotel. Now it sounded like a misplaced suitcase was just another line item in a spreadsheet. "And the worst part?" the nurse continued, voice cracking slightly. "I called customer service 3 times. Each time I got a different person. Each time they acted like I was the first one to ever lose luggage. Like it was my fault for expecting it to arrive with me." Her friend sighed. "I used to believe in this airline, really. Remember when they started? They had those little welcome cards on every seat, handwritten, and if your flight was delayed, they'd bring you a coffee. No charge, no asking. It felt human. It still says that on their website," the nurse said bitterly. "Flying with heart. Feels more like flying with a robot who's been told to pretend." Eli closed his eyes. Those welcome cards, he'd written the first 100 himself. Late nights in a cramped office, signing each one with a simple, "Thanks for trusting us." He'd believed deep in his bones that flying didn't have to be cold or transactional, that even in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, people deserved kindness. But listening now, he realized that belief hadn't been passed down. It had been packed away like old uniforms in a storage closet, replaced by scripts, KPIs, and cost per passenger metrics. A flight attendant walked down the aisle with a drink cart, her movements brisk, her smile practiced but empty. "Coffee, tea, soda?" she asked without looking up. "No thanks," the nurse said politely. The attendant nodded and moved on, not noticing the dark circles under the woman's eyes or the way her hands trembled slightly as she zipped open her cooler. Eli watched from the corner of his eye. The cooler was small, medical grade, with a faded label that read, "Insulin Keep Cold." She pulled out a vial, checked the time on her phone, then carefully measured a dose into a pen. Her movements were calm, practiced, but there was tension in her shoulders, the kind that comes from doing something important in a place that doesn't feel safe. He remembered a policy update from last year. Due to space constraints, onboard refrigeration for medications was no longer guaranteed unless prearranged 48 hours in advance. At the time, the legal team had said it was low risk. Most passengers manage fine, they'd argued. But most wasn't everyone, and fine wasn't enough. As the nurse tucked the pen back into the cooler, she glanced toward the galley. "Do you think they'd let me store this up front? Just for the last hour? The ice packs are already starting to melt." Her friend hesitated. "You could ask. But last time I asked for a blanket on a red-eye, the attendant told me to check the overhead bin." The nurse nodded, like she expected as much. She didn't get up, didn't call for help, just wrapped the cooler in her jacket and held it close as if her body heat might be enough. Eli's chest ached. This wasn't just about luggage or blankets. It was about dignity, about whether a person mattered more than a procedure. He thought about all the meetings he'd sat in where efficiency was praised and exceptions were frowned upon, where standardization became an excuse to stop seeing people as individuals. He'd nodded along, told himself it was necessary for scale. But now, sitting 3 rows from the back of his own airline, he saw the cost of that thinking, not in dollars, but in quiet disappointments and unmet needs. Outside, the sun dipped behind a cloud, casting the cabin in soft gray light. A baby started crying a few rows up. Someone groaned about turbulence. The flight attendants chatted near the galley, their voices low but sharp with fatigue. None of it was dramatic. None of it would make headlines. But together, it painted a picture of an airline that had forgotten its own heartbeat. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the same kind he'd carried in the early days. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing, not in corporate jargon but in plain, honest words. Passenger in 31E, nurse. Missed daughter's recital due to lost bag. Carrying insulin. Afraid to ask for help. Feels invisible. He wrote it not as data but as a reminder. A human being, not a ticket number. Then he wrote another line. We used to see people. Now we see problems to be managed. The words stung, but they were true. He thought about the mission statement painted on the wall of Horizon Sky's headquarters. To connect people with care, not just destinations. He'd written that himself, standing on a ladder with a paintbrush, grinning like a fool while his first team cheered. Now it felt like a museum exhibit, something preserved but no longer lived. The plane hit a patch of rough air and the seatbelt sign flickered back on. The nurse gripped her armrests, her knuckles white. Her friend reached over and held her hand again. It's okay, the friend whispered. Just a little bump. But Eli knew it wasn't just the turbulence she was bracing against. As the shaking eased, Eli made a decision. He wouldn't stay hidden the whole flight. Not if he could help, even in a small way. He wasn't here just to observe. He was here to remember what his airline was supposed to be. When the seatbelt sign went off again, he stood slowly, stretched like any ordinary passenger might, and walked toward the rear galley. One of the flight attendants, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Diane, looked up as he approached. Everything all right, sir? She asked, her tone neutral. I was wondering, Eli said, keeping his voice calm and respectful, if there's a way to keep medications cold on board. There's a passenger a couple rows up. She's got insulin and her ice packs are melting. Diane blinked, surprised. Did she ask? No, Eli said gently. I think she's worried about causing trouble. Diane's expression softened just a little. She glanced toward the nurse, then sighed. We've got a small cooler in the galley for emergencies. Policy says it's for crew use, but she trailed off, then nodded. Yeah, I'll take it to her. Thank you, Eli said. As she walked past him toward the nurse's seat, he saw something shift in her posture. Not just duty, but care. Like she'd been waiting for permission to be human again. He returned to his seat, heart pounding. It was a tiny thing, Just a cooler, just a few degrees of temperature. But it mattered. And that was the point. Back in his seat, he heard the nurse's voice again, this time lighter. "Oh, thank you, really. You have no idea how much this helps." Diane replied softly. "It's no trouble. We're supposed to look out for each other." Eli smiled to himself. That was the phrase he'd used in the very first crew training manual. We're not just staff and passengers. We're all in this together. Somewhere along the way, they'd stopped saying it. But maybe, just maybe, they hadn't forgotten it entirely. The rest of the flight passed in quiet moments. A shared snack between strangers. A flight attendant helping an elderly man find his boarding pass. A child pointing out a rainbow in the clouds. Small things, human things. And for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel like a CEO watching his company from above. He felt like a passenger, part of the story, not just the one writing it, but the real work he knew wouldn't happen at 35,000 feet. It would start the moment his feet touched the ground, because hearing the truth was only the first step. Living it, that was the hard part. The plane began its slow descent into Seattle just as the sky outside turned the color of wet slate. Raindrops streaked the window, blurring the patchwork of neighborhoods and highways below. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendants moved with renewed purpose, collecting trash, locking carts, checking seatbelts. Everything felt routine, except for the knot still tight in Eli's chest he hadn't expected to step in. He told himself he was just there to listen, to absorb, to gather the truth without interfering. But when he'd seen the nurse holding that cooler like it was the only thing keeping her steady, something in him had snapped back into place. It wasn't about fixing one problem. It was about remembering who they were supposed to be. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that followed his small act of help. Not because he regretted it, but because it shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. A passenger carrying life-sustaining medication shouldn't have to hope someone notices her struggle. The crew shouldn't need a stranger's nudge to offer basic support. And yet here they were. As the plane banked gently over Puget Sound, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their full upright and locked positions." The voice was smooth, professional, but empty of warmth. Eli remembered the first time he'd recorded a captain's welcome message. He'd insisted it sound like a real person talking to friends, not a robot reading a script. "Hey there," it had begun. "Thanks for flying with us today. We know you've got places to be and people to see, so we'll get you there safe and smiling." That message had been retired 3 years ago for being too informal. Now, the only thing smiling was the logo on the seatback pocket. The landing gear thumped down, and the plane shuddered as it met the runway. A collective exhale moved through the cabin. People began gathering their things: phones, jackets, half-finished books. The nurse zipped her cooler carefully and tucked it into her tote bag, her shoulders a little less tense than before. Eli stayed seated until nearly everyone had filed out. He watched the crew move through their post-flight checklist, efficient, quiet, already mentally clocked out. Diane, the flight attendant who'd helped with the cooler, caught his eye as she wiped down a tray table. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not gratitude, recognition. Like she knew somehow that he wasn't just another passenger. He stepped into the jet bridge, the cool airport air a relief after the recycled cabin atmosphere. But instead of heading straight to baggage claim or ground transportation, he lingered near the gate. He wanted to see what happened next. The unscripted moments no report would ever capture. A young father struggled with a stroller and a crying toddler while trying to answer a work call. No one offered to help. A woman in a wheelchair waited by the jet bridge door for nearly 10 minutes before a skycap finally appeared, muttering about last-minute requests. And near the gate podium, a Horizon Skies agent stood with arms crossed, scrolling on her phone while a passenger stood awkwardly nearby, holding a crumpled boarding pass. "Excuse me," the passenger finally said. "My connecting flight was canceled. They said someone here would rebook me?" The agent didn't look up. "Gate 14, customer service desk." But I was told, "Gate 14, she repeated, still not making eye contact. The passenger sighed and walked away. Shoulders slumped. Eli's stomach turned. This wasn't just bad service. It was a culture that had stopped seeing people as people, Somewhere between growth targets and operational efficiency, the human thread had been pulled so thin it was nearly invisible. He walked slowly through the terminal, not heading anywhere in particular. His phone buzzed in his pocket. 3 missed calls from his assistant, a string of urgent emails flagged red. He ignored them all. Right now, none of it mattered as much as what he'd just witnessed. Outside, rain fell steadily, turning the pavement into a mirror of taxi lights and neon signs. He didn't call for a car. Instead, he found a bus stop a few blocks from the terminal and sat on the wet bench, hood pulled up against the drizzle. He needed space, quiet. Time to think without the noise of the office, the expectations, the endless cycle of more, faster, cheaper. A city bus rumbled to a stop in front of him, doors hissing open. An older man with a grocery bag stepped off, nodded at Eli, and shuffled away. The bus driver gave a quick wave before pulling back into traffic. Small kindnesses offered without fanfare. That's what he missed. Not grand gestures, but the everyday decency that used to be the backbone of Horizon Skies. He thought about the early days again, how he'd hired for heart, not just resumes. He'd once turned down a candidate with perfect credentials because during the interview, they'd snapped at the receptionist for bringing the wrong coffee. If you can't treat the person who hands you a cup with respect, he'd said, you won't treat our passengers any better. Now, he wondered how many of those values had been quietly traded for speed and scale. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his chief operations officer. Board meeting moved to 9 a.m. tomorrow. Ready to present Q3 results? Eli stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, not yet. Need to think. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. They'd all assumed he was on some luxury retreat or private island, recharging. No one knew he'd spent the day in the back of a coach cabin, listening to the quiet erosion of everything he'd built. The rain let up just as dusk settled over the city. He stood, stretched his legs, and started walking. Not toward a hotel or a car service, but toward a neighborhood he remembered from his first year in Seattle, a place with old brick buildings, mom-and-pop diners, and sidewalks that still felt lived in. He found a small diner tucked between a bookstore and a bike repair shop. The sign above the door read Maggie's Corner in peeling paint. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon, and something faintly sweet, maybe apple pie. A bell jingled as he stepped in. Seat yourself, hun, called a woman behind the counter, wiping her hands on an apron. Eli chose a booth by the window, the kind with cracked vinyl and a wobbly table. It felt honest. Real. He ordered black coffee and watched the rain return, soft now, tapping against the glass like a quiet reminder. When the coffee came, he pulled out his notebook again. The pages were damp at the edges from the walk, but the words were clear. He flipped past his notes from the flight and started fresh. We've built a machine that runs smoothly, but forgot to ask if it's running for the right reasons. He wrote about the nurse's flower pin, the insulin cooler, the father with the stroller, the passenger ignored at the gate. He didn't write solutions yet. Just truths. Raw, uncomfortable, necessary. A couple sat down at the next booth laughing over pancakes. An elderly man read a newspaper at the counter sipping soup. No one was in a hurry. No one was performing. They were just being. And that's what flying used to feel like. Not a transaction, but a shared moment in time. A space where strangers could be kind, where help was offered before it was asked for, where you walked off the plane feeling like you'd been seen, not scanned. He finished his coffee and signaled for the check. As he paid, he left a generous tip, not out of guilt but gratitude, for the reminder that humanity still existed, even if his company had temporarily misplaced it. Back outside, the city lights shimmered through the rain. He didn't call a ride. He kept walking, letting the cool air clear his head. His phone buzzed once more. Another email, another deadline. He silenced it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pull of the office. He felt the pull of purpose, and he knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow wouldn't be about quarterly results. It would be about rebuilding something far more important, trust. Not with press releases or marketing campaigns, but with actions, with changes that started at the top and flowed down, not as orders but as invitations to remember. He thought about Diane, the flight attendant who'd softened when given the chance to help. He thought about the pilot who'd flown with steady hands but never said a word to the cabin. He thought about the hundreds of employees who'd joined Horizon Skies because they believed in its promise and who were now just going through the motions because no one had reminded them why it mattered. Eli stopped under a street lamp, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He took a deep breath. Tomorrow he'd go back. Not as the distant CEO, but as the founder who'd once slept on airport floors to understand his customers. He'd sit with the crew, listen to the ground staff, walk the terminals like a passenger, not a boss. And he'd start with one simple question. What would make you proud to wear this uniform again? Because if they could find that answer, the rest would follow. The rain slowed to a mist. Somewhere in the distance, a plane took off, its lights blinking into the night sky. Eli watched it climb, steady and sure. He had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The next morning, Eli didn't go to the corporate tower. He didn't put on a suit or step into his corner office with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Instead, he woke before sunrise, made a pot of strong coffee in the small Airbnb he'd booked under his real name this time, and spread his notebook across the kitchen table. Pages filled with scribbled observations, passenger quotes, crew mannerisms, policy gaps, none of it polished, all of it raw. He read through it slowly, not as a CEO reviewing data, but as a person trying to understand where the heart had gone missing. By 7 a.m., he was back at the airport, not through the executive entrance, not with a security escort, but through the same sliding doors any passenger would use. He wore the same flannel shirt from the flight, jeans, and his worn boots. No cap this time. He wanted to be seen. His first stop wasn't the headquarters. It was the crew lounge near Gate B12, a narrow room most passengers never see, tucked behind a plain gray door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Inside, flight attendants gathered before their morning shifts, sipping coffee from paper cups, checking schedules on tablets, tying scarves with tired hands. The air smelled of burnt coffee and faint perfume. A low hum of conversation filled the space. Some laughter, some sighs, the kind of mix that comes from people who spend long hours together in tight spaces. Eli stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure. Then he stepped inside, a few heads turned. Some recognized him instantly. The founder's face was still on the company intranet, though rarely seen in person these days. Others squinted, confused. One veteran attendant, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun, set down her mug and walked over. "Eli Tran?" she asked, voice cautious but not unkind. He nodded. "Morning." She studied him for a beat, then said, "You look like you've been sleeping on park benches." He almost laughed. "Close, a diner booth." She gestured to an empty table in the corner. "Sit, before someone calls corporate security thinking you're an imposter." He sat. She brought him a fresh cup of coffee, black, no sugar, just how he used to take it. "You haven't been down here in, what, 5 years?" "7, he admitted. She pulled up a chair. We noticed he didn't flinch. "I know." For a while they just sat in silence watching the room. A young attendant nervously rehearsed a safety announcement under her breath. 2 others debated the best way to calm a crying baby at 30,000 feet. Someone played soft jazz from a portable speaker. It felt lived in, human. Exactly the kind of place where real insights were born if anyone was listening. Finally, Eli spoke. "Tell me what's broken." She didn't hesitate. "Everything that used to make us proud." He waited. "We're not allowed to use our judgment anymore," she said, voice low. "If a passenger needs help, we have to check a flowchart. If a flight's delayed, we can't offer a meal unless it's past a certain minute mark, even if someone's missed a funeral. We used to be trusted to do the right thing. Now we're told the right thing is whatever saves the company the most money." Eli's chest tightened. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad." "You stopped asking," she said gently. Not accusing. Just stating a fact, he nodded. "I did." She leaned forward. "We still care. Every single one of us. But it's hard to care when you feel like a cog in a machine that doesn't care back." He wrote that down, not in shorthand, in full. "We still care. But it's hard to care when you feel like a cog in a machine that doesn't care back." After an hour, more crew members drifted over, pilots, gate agents, even a baggage handler who'd heard the founder was actually talking to people. No one shouted. No one demanded raises or blamed leadership. They just shared stories. The elderly woman who cried when no one helped her find her gate. The veteran who missed his son's graduation because his rebooking request was denied. The new hire who quit after 2 weeks because it didn't feel like the airline I signed up for. Eli listened. Really listened. Not to fix, not to defend, just to understand. By 9 a.m., he was supposed to be in a boardroom presenting polished slides about profit margins. Instead, he was in a cramped crew lounge with ink-stained fingers and a heart full of regret. He stood. "Thank you," he said to the room, "for your honesty, for still showing up even when it's hard." Then he walked out, not to his car but to the main terminal. He found a quiet corner near an empty gate, pulled out his phone and called his executive assistant. "Cancel the board meeting," he said. There was a pause. "Sir, the investors are already—" "Cancel it! Reschedule everything for next week. I'm not coming in today. But the Q3 report? Tell them the most important report I'll deliver isn't in numbers. It's in people." He hung up before she could argue. Back at his Airbnb, he sat at the kitchen table again. This time he didn't just write notes. He drafted a memo. Not the kind full of jargon and bullet points. Just plain English. From one human to another. It started like this. "To every person who wears a Horizon Skies uniform, I flew coach last week. Not as the founder. Just as a passenger. And what I saw broke my heart. Not because things were broken, but because I realized I'd stopped seeing them. We built this airline on a simple idea. That flying should feel human. That kindness isn't extra, it's essential. Somewhere along the way we lost that. Not because we stopped caring, but because we let systems replace soul. That ends now." He went on to outline immediate changes. Flight attendants could offer meals or accommodations based on need, not just policy. Lost luggage would be tracked with personal follow-ups, not automated emails. Every crew member would get one compassion override per month, a chance to bend a rule to do what's right. No questions asked. He'd be flying coach regularly, not to spy, but to listen. He called it Project Compass not because it was fancy, but because they needed to find their direction again. Before sending it company-wide, he read it aloud to himself. It sounded nervous, imperfect, human, good. He hit send at 11:03 a.m. Within minutes, his phone lit up, not with angry calls from executives, but with messages from crew members he hadn't heard from in years. "Thank you for remembering us. I cried reading this. Feels like coming home. Does this mean I can finally help that passenger who needs a blanket without filling out a form?" He answered each one. Not with corporate speak, but with, "Yes, I'm sorry it took so long and let's fix this together." That afternoon he returned to the airport, not to observe, but to act. He found the nurse from Flight 422. It wasn't hard. Her name and flight details were in the customer service log, flagged as unresolved luggage. He didn't call her. He went to the address listed on her frequent flyer profile, a modest apartment complex on the edge of the city. He knocked on her door just after 5 p.m. She opened it, eyes wide with surprise. "I'm Eli Tran," he said. "Founder of Horizon Skies," she blinked. "The guy from the flight?" He nodded. "I heard you missed your daughter's recital." Her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay. She understands." "It's not okay," he said gently. "And I'm here to fix it." He handed her a small box. Inside was a new flower pin, simple silver, shaped like a forget-me-not. "We found your bag," he lied. They hadn't, but they would. "But even if we hadn't, you deserved better." Then he handed her a letter. Not a voucher. Not a coupon. A handwritten note on Horizon Skies letterhead. "To the passenger who reminded us why we fly, you are seen. You are valued. And you'll never be just a ticket number again." At the bottom, a lifetime pass, unlimited flights, any class, no blackout dates. She didn't say much. Just hugged the box to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't stay long. Didn't ask for a photo or a testimonial. He just walked away, knowing this wasn't about making her happy. It was about making good on a promise he'd forgotten he'd made. That night, he didn't go back to the Airbnb. He booked a room at a budget hotel near the airport. In the morning, he'd be on another coach flight, this time to Portland. Listening again, learning again, because change didn't happen in boardrooms. It happened in conversations, in coolers kept cold, in pins replaced, in voices finally heard, and for the first time in years Eli Tran wasn't leading from the top. He was walking beside the people who'd always carried the soul of his airline, even when he'd stopped noticing. The work was just beginning. But the compass was set, and this time he wouldn't let it spin. 6 months later, Eli Tran boarded another Horizon Skies flight, this time not in disguise. Not in the back row, but right where he belonged, in coach, seat 18C, window. He still wore the same flannel shirt, though it was newer now and his boots were scuffed from weeks of walking terminals, crew lounges, and baggage claim areas. He no longer needed to hide. He was there to see what had grown from the seeds he'd planted. The gate area felt different. Not flashy, not overhauled with expensive renovations, but warmer. A gate agent noticed an elderly man struggling with a walker and walked him all the way to the jet bridge, chatting with him the whole way. A flight attendant knelt to help a child zip up a too-big jacket. No one was performing. It just felt like people helping people. As he settled into his seat, a woman 2 rows ahead turned and smiled. "You're the founder, right?" He nodded. "My sister flies for Horizon," she said. "She told me you've been riding coach every other week. Said you actually talked to the crew." "I try," he said. "She also said you brought donuts to the overnight team in Chicago last month." He chuckled. "They deserved them." "Worked through a snowstorm with no complaints." The woman's eyes softened. "It shows. Things feel kinder now." That word, kinder, stuck with him as the plane taxied. It wasn't about speed or luxury. It was about kindness. The simplest thing and the easiest to lose. During the flight, he watched quietly. A flight attendant noticed a passenger looking pale and offered ginger ale before being asked. Another helped a young mother stow a stroller without being called over. When turbulence hit, the captain's voice came over the intercom, not with a sterile, "Please remain seated," but with, "We're hitting a few bumps, folks. Nothing to worry about, but hang tight. We'll have you home soon." It was the same tone Eli remembered from the early days. Calm, reassuring, human. And then, halfway through the flight, he saw her. The nurse from Flight 422. She was sitting near the front this time, in an aisle seat, her cooler tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. She looked rested. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail and she was reading a book, something with a bright yellow cover. When she glanced up and saw him, her eyes widened. Then she smiled, a real, quiet smile that reached her eyes. After landing, she waited near the jet bridge as passengers filed out. When Eli reached her, she didn't say much, just held out a small envelope. Inside was a photo. A little girl in a blue dress, seated at a piano, beaming at the camera. On the back, in careful handwriting, "For the man who gave my mom a second chance. Thank you for listening." Eli's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. "She had another recital last month," the nurse said softly. "I was there. Front row." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then, "How's the flower pin?" She touched her lapel. The silver forget-me-not gleamed under the terminal lights. "Wear it every time I fly." They stood there for a beat. 2 strangers bound by a moment neither had planned but both would carry forever. "I didn't do it for thanks," Eli finally said. "I know," she replied. "That's why it mattered." Back at headquarters, the changes had taken root, not overnight, not perfectly, but deeply. Project Compass wasn't just a memo anymore. It was a rhythm. Crew members used their compassion overrides not as loopholes but as lifelines, for passengers who missed weddings, for parents traveling with sick kids, for veterans returning home. Lost luggage recovery time had dropped by 60%, not because of new tech, but because someone now called the passenger personally, every step of the way. Eli still held board meetings, still reviewed financials, but he started each one the same way, by reading a note from a passenger or a crew member. Not the complaints, the quiet moments of connection, the ones that reminded everyone why they were really there. One morning he walked into the main training center unannounced. New hires were gathered for orientation. Instead of letting the instructor run the usual script, Eli stepped up. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your job," he said. "I'm here to remind you why it matters." He told them about the nurse, about the cooler, about the silence that spoke louder than any complaint. "You won't always get applause," he said. "But sometimes just noticing someone, that's enough. That's everything." Afterward, a young flight attendant stopped him in the hallway. My mom used to fly Horizon all the time, she said. She said it felt like family. I joined because of that. I was scared it wasn't true anymore. And now? He asked. She smiled. Now I believe it again. That was the real metric. Not net promoter score, not on-time performance, but belief that Eli kept flying coach. Not as a stunt, not for PR, but because it kept him honest. He'd sit by windows, listen to conversations, sometimes just say thank you to a crew member who'd gone the extra mile. He never introduced himself unless asked. Most didn't recognize him, and that was fine. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to see. One rainy evening in Seattle, he found himself back at Maggie's Corner, the same diner from that first night after the flight. The booth was still wobbly, the coffee still strong. He ordered pie this time.